not condone, promote investment, or claim to offer expertise in the Ethereum investment. Any logos used does not constitute an official partnership with these organizations. The Ethereum logo belongs to Ethereum Foundation, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. This is a brief outline of our workshop. So I'll be taking you through an introduction of blockchain, followed by a live view, which is basically a blockchain explorer, which I will get into at that time. After which I will be diving deeper into certain concepts of blockchain. Then Asa will be taking over for the second half of the workshop, where she will be talking about smart contracts. Then Ethereum, which is one of the most popular public blockchain networks, followed by a hands-on exercise. So let's get started. So what is blockchain? To give you guys a better idea of what blockchain is, I'm sure you guys have heard about it somewhere or the other, either in the news or from your friends or at school. Now, to give a better idea about it, just imagine this scenario. So what if you could send money to someone without the bank's interference in a matter of seconds instead of days? That is, you have your own online wallet over which you have complete control over. There is no third-party interference whatsoever. Well, this is what blockchain is about. So it was actually introduced by Satoshi Nakamoto. He actually created the first blockchain network, which is Bitcoin. And a more formal definition of blockchain would be that it's an immutable distributed digital ledger. That means that it has all the existing records from the inception of that blockchain network, and it can be readily seen by everyone who is part of the network. So another thing to note is that it can't really be changed by anyone quite easily. Now I'll be going into the basic structure of a blockchain network. So, oops, my bad. Yeah, so every transaction or record is stored in a block, and a block typically consists of multiple transactions. Now the information in each block is dependent on the information present in the previous block and is linked to it. So over time, a chain of blocks is formed, and this is how the blockchain networks as we know today have come to exist. Now I'll be going into the most important characteristics of blockchain, that is its immutability and the distributed network, which basically boils down to decentralization. Now, when anyone says that blockchain is immutable, it doesn't really mean that you can't change the data. It just means that any data or any block that exists on the network can't be changed without it going unnoticed. Now, why is that? So basically, each node in the network has a copy of all the transactions that have occurred throughout the lifetime of that network. So even if one node, that is one computer system that is involved in the blockchain network, has a corrupted form of the data or has tampered with the data for its own personal benefit, then the other nodes in the system can cross-verify with their own copy of the ledger and realize that the data has been corrupted and will not consider it as legitimate. Moreover, if any blocks are created by that node, they will just ignore it. So this is what it actually means when you say that blockchain is immutable. Another thing is, another major characteristic of blockchain is the decentralization part of it. That is, everyone is empowered to participate in the network. So what it basically means is that no one has to really follow any central authority or any so-called protocols that have been designed to prevent malpractices. Everyone can participate in their own way. Now, one good thing about the decentralization part of it is that now blockchain networks are not susceptible to single points of failure. Now, systemic failures like that of Wall Street or that brought down an economy or an economic system rather, can lead to a large impact. Now, even if a website crashes or ATM software stops working, then it also leads to a huge amount of loss. But in a blockchain network, even if one node fails, or if one computer just goes offline for a while, the network is still up and running. Nothing has been majorly lost out of it. The workload of one node just shifts to another. Yeah, so this is about the important characteristics of blockchain. So there are also different types of blockchain depending on the access restrictions. So the most popular one is the public blockchain. It's basically a decentralized system of computers which is accessible to everyone. That is, anyone can request transactions or even validate them. So some common examples are Bitcoin and Ethereum. Now, private blockchains have some access restrictions. That is, to participate in the network, you need permission from a system administrator and is also governed by a central authority. So it basically has certain centralized characteristics. And one example of this is Hyperledger. Now, there are some blockchains that are hybrid. That is, they are a combination of public and private blockchains. So they have centralized and decentralized characteristics. And some examples of this would be Dragon Chain and F3. Now, a sidechain form of blockchain consists of like a multiple chains running in parallel to the main chain. So the whole idea behind this is so that assets can be transferred between chains. And one common example is a liquid network. So how exactly does a public blockchain work? So firstly, you have a blockchain wallet, which is basically a digital wallet that enables one to manage, store, and trade digital assets and cryptocurrencies. Now, this can be set up very easily, and each account holder gets a unique identification number, which is used as an address in a transaction. Now, the nodes or the computer systems that confirm and verify transactions are called miners. So the verification is done by running a series of algorithms called mining. So the verification process is pretty competitive, as the first miner to complete a new block is given network fees for the contribution. So it's literally the fastest thing of first. So going more into the details of how a transaction is created and how is it finally added to the blockchain. This is how it happens. So first, a new transaction is entered, and then it is broadcasted to the entire network. And then the network of computers solve equations. That is, the miners try to solve complex mathematical problems to confirm the validity of these transactions. Now, once they have been confirmed as legitimate, they are clustered together to form blocks. And these blocks, they get chained together to form the huge history of transactions that we know blockchain to be today. So once a block has been added to the network, that is when the transaction is considered as complete. But then again, there are certain situations where the transactions may be considered invalid. And I will be talking about that soon. Right? So, like adding on to what I've already mentioned of how a public blockchain works. So the miners validate a list of transactions by solving a complex mathematical problem to produce a hash, which is a 64-digit hexadecimal number. Now, every block is assigned its own hash and is added to the network with this hash. Once added, the transaction fees of all of these transactions is the miner's reward. That is, once a transaction is created, you need to pay a certain amount of fees to the miner who is validating your transaction and getting it added to the network. And this is what the miner finally gets from mining a block. So this is a basic introduction about blockchain. Now I'll be taking you through a live view. That is, I'll be introducing one of the blockchain explorers to you guys. So give me a second. Yeah, so before getting into the exact details of this website, I just want to briefly introduce what a blockchain explorer is. Now, I hope you guys don't confuse this with the actual tools of a blockchain network that help one to participate in the network. It's not that. A blockchain explorer is pretty much a search engine where you can look up different transactions and see data related to them. Basically, blockchain explorers use APIs to query data and show it to users in a comprehensible manner. So even now, if you look at any website, you can see live data regarding how blocks are being mined and all the data associated with it. So right now, I'll be taking you through EtherChain, which is one of the oldest Ethereum blockchain explorers. And quite frankly, one of the only ones that NTU hasn't blocked, which is why we're using this in this workshop. Another point that I would like to add is I'll be going through the major features in this website and giving you a brief outline about it, but I won't be able to cover each and every part of this website due to lack of time. So you guys can look into it yourselves and explore more. And moreover, I don't want to dump too much information on you guys. So let's get started. So as you can see a few information regarding the average, regarding various parameters of the blockchain network. I'm not really getting into that. What I want to show you guys is this. So you can look up the most recent blocks and you can choose how many blocks you want to look at a time. So you can go for 50 or you can go for 100. So if you notice, for each block, you can see the block number, the block hash, the miner of the block, the time at which it was created, the number of transactions present in the block, and the reward for the block. That is the fees that the miner gets at the end of it by creating this block. So in Ethereum, there is a default base reward of 2 Ether. Ether is basically the cryptocurrency that is used for Ethereum. So you get a base price, or rather a base reward of 2 Ether. And on top of that, whatever additional reward that the miner gets is basically the transaction fees. So apart from these, you can see a lot of other information about the block. One thing that I would like to highlight is the difficulty level of the block. So this is primarily related to how exactly a block gets added to the network. So if you remember, I had said that a complex problem has to be solved in order for a miner to create a block and get it added to the network. Now, this complex problem basically is them having to create a hash which meets certain criteria. Now, a hash is created, that is the 64-digit hexadecimal number, is created based on the contents of the block. And if I change any part of the block, the hash gets changed. So there is this field called nonce, which can be randomly set by the miner, after which the hash will be computed. So basically, they have to create a hash which is below a certain target value. Now, this value is set periodically according to the network protocols. So what happens basically is the miners need to create a hash that is below that target hash. And this difficulty level is an indicator of how much computation is needed in order to create that block. So basically, if it needs more computation, if it needs to calculate more hashes or needs to go through more attempts, then the difficulty level will be higher, and which means more computation is required. So that's pretty much about difficulty. And if you click any particular number in the block, you can again see the block hash, the miner, the reward, and things like transaction fees and gas usage. Now I'll be going into this part. So what is gas exactly in terms of blockchain? It basically signifies the units of computation that you need in order to execute a transaction. Now, a transaction can have several operations. That is, it can be as simple as having a send transaction between two people, just a simple transfer of assets, or it can be slightly more complicated in terms of smart contracts, which has a little more logic, which Asta will go into later. So each step has a certain set of operations, and each operation needs a certain unit of computation. Now, each unit of computation is known as gas. So when a transaction has been created, two values have to be known to the network, have to be made known to the network by the creator of that transaction. The first one is the gas limit. That is the maximum number of units of gas they are willing to let the miner use to finish that transaction. And gas price, which is basically the maximum amount they are willing to pay per unit of gas. So these are the maximum limits. So the transaction fees is basically a product of the actual units of gas that is used for that transaction and the gas price at that time. So they just specify the maximum limits they are willing to go to. It's not the final, it is not what will always happen to at the end. So the gas price depends on the supply and demand of gas units in the network at that time. And the gas units is known to the miner when he or she executes a transaction. Now, for example, over here, almost this huge amount of gas units have been set as a limit, but finally only 66% of it has been used. Similarly, the lowest gas price across all transactions in this block is 86 Gwei. Gwei is a subunit of ether, which is almost 10 to the power minus 9 units of 1 ether. Now, this is the lowest gas price, but that doesn't necessarily mean, so that basically means that each transaction has a different gas price, and only at the time at which the transaction is executed, the gas price at that time is considered. Yeah. And the base fee is basically the minimum gas price that has to be set in order for it to be considered into the block. This is basically calculated on the basis of previous blocks. So if you want your transaction to be added to this particular block, you're probably going to have to set a a gas price that is higher than this. So that's about the main thing in this page. So apart from all of these details, you can also see the transactions present in a block. So you can see the hash value, the from address, the to address, the amount that has been transferred, the fees for the block, and the gas price at that time. So basically it means at the time at which the transaction was executed, this was the gas price at that time. And apart from this, you can also see details of the person who has actually mined this block. Oh, give me a second. Yeah, so if I click the miner, you can see the address of the miner, his name, the balance. You can also see the transactions the miner has been involved in. You can also see the blocks that particular miner has created and the reward the miner got for it. And you can also see the number of uncle blocks the miner has created. Now, uncle blocks need a little bit more information and context to explain, so I'll be getting into that in a bit. So that's pretty much what I have for Blockchain Explorers for you guys today. You can, of course, explore more and let me know your questions in Slido. So going back to the slides. Give me a second. Yeah, so going more into some more concepts of blockchain. Right now I'll be focusing on the decentralization in blockchain. So decisions are made via consensus over the network. That is, it primarily involves proof of work and proof of stake. So one of the most well-known consensus protocol to determine if a transaction is valid or if a block has been successfully mined is the proof of work protocol. This basically involves solving the complex mathematical problem, which I mentioned related to difficulty levels and the hashing. So since this is basically brute force or trial and error, that is, they keep changing the nonce in order to get a hash that satisfies the condition, it uses up a lot of electricity and in turn wastes a lot of energy too. And more than that, the number of transactions that can be processed simultaneously are very limited. So a significant trade-off of this protocol is that it is very slow. So to combat this, there is another protocol that has been introduced, which is called proof of stake. Oh, sorry, my bad. Give me a second. Yeah. So this proof of stake still uses cryptographic algorithms for validation. It's just that the transaction gets validated by a chosen validator, or rather a set of validators, based on the number of coins they hold. And this is known as their stake. So the greater the number of coins they have, higher is the mining power. So to ensure that the person with the highest number of coins isn't always selected, there is something called randomized block selection and coinage selection that is used. That is, a coinage selection is basically the longer coins have been accumulated, the greater weight it has. So these chosen set of validators either create a new block or validate blocks that haven't been created by them. So a block gets added to the network only if 2/3 of the validators have validated it. And this validation is actually called attestation. So if the validators fail to validate a block, then they could lose a portion of their coins. And if they are involved in any tampering or they collude together for any malpractices, then they might as well lose their entire stash of coins. So as the name suggests, quite literally, these validators have quite a bit at stake here. So basically in Bitcoin and Ethereum, they are using proof of work right now. But as of August of this year, Ethereum is planning to shift to proof of stake in another 1 year. Now, I've talked so much about how a block gets mined and how it's officially added to the network. But this is all considering if there is one block that is mined at a given point of time. But what if two or more blocks are mined at a certain point of time? So the most common way of resolving this is the longest chain rule. That is, the longest chain is considered the valid version of the blockchain. Now, how is the longest chain determined? Basically, you accumulate the difficulty levels of the blocks from the branching point. And the one that has a higher difficulty level is the one that is considered the longest chain. Logically speaking, it is basically the branch that involved a much more greater amount of work in order to get created. Now, the transactions that are part of the shorter chain will be considered invalid, which is why it's a good idea to consider your cryptocurrency or digital assets from a particular transaction to be yours truly only if the block that contains that particular transaction is a few levels deep in the network. Usually, it's a good idea to consider your transaction actually permanent only if it is at least 6 levels deep. Otherwise, it could very well be the case that some other branch pops up and it becomes the longest chain, after which your transaction pretty much ceases to exist. So this is about the longest chain rule. So now, since we're on the topic of different chains, I'll briefly introduce you guys to forks. So forks basically happen when there is a change in the software of the blockchain network. There are two types of forks, hard forks and soft forks. So hard forks involve a radical change in the software. That is, all nodes in the network have to upgrade to the current version. If they don't, they are not considered a part of the network, which basically means you have two versions of the blockchain network coexisting. Now, a software fork also involves a software update, but it doesn't mean that two networks have to necessarily exist. It is backwards compatible. That is, the old nodes can still participate in the network. And at the end of the day, you basically still have one network. It's not split into two. So that's about forks. Now I'll be talking a bit more about the security aspects in blockchain. And the main thing that ensures security in blockchain is hashing. So first, I'll briefly introduce you to hashing. So hashing is basically generating a value of fixed length, or rather a string of fixed length from a string of text using a mathematical function. This basically enables security during the process of message transmission. Now, these are some characteristic properties of a cryptographic hash function. Without these, like, the hash functions wouldn't even be useful. Like, these are critical in order for a hash function to be useful and to ensure security. The first thing is that it should be deterministic. That is, given an input, no matter how many times you hash it, you will still have the same output. That is, one input will give one output only. And another thing is that these hash functions need to involve quick computation. That is, if I give an input to the hash, I should be able to quickly figure out what the hash is. Another thing, and the most important property I would say, is pre-image resistance. That is, hash functions are pretty much a one-way street. From an input, you can get a hash when you pass it to the hash function. But just with the hash, you cannot get back the original input. It's just not possible. And another thing is that small changes in the input changes the output drastically. And this is called avalanche effect. And this is what determines the immutability of a blockchain network. So remember what I said, that if a small change is made to the blockchain network, it can't go unnoticed by everyone. This is primarily why. So if you change the contents of a block, its block hash will change drastically. So if anyone just passes the content of the block header to a hash function, they will easily notice that the current hash and the computed hash do not match. So they can easily see that the blocks have been tampered with, and thus you can ensure that the information presented in a blockchain network is accurate and is true. Now, the last property of a hash function is that it is collision resistant. That is, in an ideal case scenario, two different inputs cannot give the same output. Now, this is a very ideal scenario, but at the end of the day, since the outputs are of fixed length, there is still a very, very, very small probability that two different inputs give the same output. if that happens, then the hash function is pretty much compromised. And that's why they keep people keep researching and finding new hash functions in order to make ensure the security of the blockchain network. Now, how exactly does this apply to blockchain? How does hashing apply to blockchain? So the digital wallets are used to store private and public keys. Your private key is basically a 32-byte number which shouldn't be shared with anyone. It's basically like your password, and it's what grants you ownership of your funds and digital assets in that given that is related to your address. Now, public keys, as the name suggests, is publicly available to everyone. And since it is a hash function from which it has been derived from your public key, you cannot get back the person's private key, which means your private key will definitely stay safe as long as you don't share it with anyone. And your address is again derived from your public key. So how exactly does the private and public key fit into all of this? It basically ensures security of transmission from the sender to the receiver. And this is how it works. Now consider A to be the sender and B to be the receiver. So A will basically use A's private key to digitally sign the message. That is, it will send the message and its private key through a function which gives the signature as its output. And then A will use B's public key to encrypt the message. Now B, on receiving the message, will use B's private key to decrypt the message. And then B will use A's public key to verify the signature. That is, once again, it will send the message and A's public key to a function which gives a Boolean value of whether this public key is associated with the same private key that gave the signature. And then it will verify the signature, and that is how security is ensured in blockchain using hashing. So that's all I have for you guys. Now Astha will be taking over. Do let me know if you guys have any questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nisha. Okay, so I will start with I will be talking about smart contracts. So smart contracts are simply programs stored on a blockchain Smart contracts are simply programs stored on a blockchain that run when predetermined conditions are met. And they are typically used to automate the execution of an agreement so that all participants can be immediately certain of the outcome without any intermediaries' involvement or time loss. They can also automate a workflow, triggering the next action when conditions are met. Smart contracts thus allow the execution of user-defined operations of arbitrary complexity. This feature helps in enhancing the capability of Ethereum blockchain to be a powerful decentralized computing system. The next question that comes is, why do we need smart contracts? And before addressing this, I would like to ask you, why would you want to transfer currency? So cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin enable transfer of values such as money or currency from peer to peer without any intermediaries. And this is for what? It could be to gift somebody, to buy a product, or maybe even renew a driver's license. Let us take a deeper look in this. We may want the gift to be delivered on a certain date, buy a product of a particular color and quality, and we may need some credentials verified for renewing the license. Now, what this does is it introduces conditions, rules, policies, beyond that of which a simple money transfer cryptocurrency protocol can handle. So smart contract addresses this need for application-specific validation for blockchain applications. Smart contract has some advantages, including that it facilitates transaction or transfer of assets other than value or cryptocurrency. It allows specification of rules for an operation on the blockchain. It facilitates implementation of policies for transfer of assets in a decentralized network. It also adds programmability and intelligence to the blockchain. The smart contract thus represents a business logic layer with the actual logic coded in a special high-level language, like Solidity. A smart contract embeds functions that can be invoked by messages that are like function calls. These messages are input parameters for a single message and are specified in a transaction. You will get a better idea about this when we look at a demonstration later on. So how do the smart contracts work? Smart contracts work by following simple statement, that is, if something happens, then do something else. These statements are written into code on a blockchain. A network of computers execute the actions when predetermined conditions have been met and verified. These actions could include releasing funds to the appropriate parties, registering a vehicle, sending notifications, or even issuing a ticket. The blockchain is then updated when the transaction is completed. That means the transaction cannot be changed and only parties who have been granted permission can see the results. If you look at the image on the slide, you can see that the option contract is written as code into a blockchain. The contract then becomes a part of the public blockchain. The parties involved in this contract remain anonymous, and the contract executes itself when the conditions are met. The regulators use the blockchain to keep an eye on the contracts. So within a smart contract, there can be as many stipulations as needed to satisfy the participants that the task will be completed satisfactorily. To establish the terms, participants must determine how transactions and their data are represented on the blockchain and agree on the if-then statement. That is the rules that govern those transactions. It is especially necessary to explore all possible exceptions and define a framework for resolving disputes. We will see an example later on, and then you will get a better idea of how this works. Then the smart contract can be programmed by a developer, although increasingly organizations that use blockchain for business provide templates, web interfaces, and other online tools to simplify structuring smart contracts. Now we will see the structure of a smart contract. So as we had discussed earlier, smart contracts work with the application-specific semantics and constraints of the transaction and verifies, validates, and executes them. Most of all, since it is deployed on the blockchain, the smart contract leverages the immutable recording and trust model of the blockchain. Since they are immutable, if we want to change it, we will have to redeploy the code as a new smart contract or somehow redirect the calls from an old contract to the new one. So what all is included in a smart contract? Smart contract stores variables in it called the state variables. We could also retrieve how these variables change over the blocks. Contract in the Ethereum blockchain has a pragma directive, name of the contract, data or the state variables that define the state of the contract, and the collection of functions to carry out the intent of a smart contract. Let us look at a more detailed structure. So firstly, we have the data or state variables. Second are functions. Now these can be of several types. For example, public functions, which are accessible from outside of the transaction. Next, we have private function, accessible only within the current contract. Internal functions, which are accessible inside the current contract and inherited contracts. Then we have external functions that can be accessed only from outside the contract. There are also constructors. Now a constructor can either be default or user specified, but it is important to note that we can use only one, which means that it cannot be overloaded. So you can use either the default one or you can specify your own. There are also fallback function, which is a powerful feature of an anonymous function. Pure functions are those that do not allow the state of the contract to change. They compute under terms of value, for example, math functions. Now, user-defined types include structs and enums, and we also have events. We will see some of these in the demonstration, then you will get a better idea of how they are used. Another point I want to add on is that besides this explicit intent, a smart contract can also inherit from other contracts. For the demonstration, we will be using Solidity as a high-level language for implementing a smart contract. So Solidity is a combination of JavaScript, Java, and C++. It is specially designed to write smart contracts and to target the Ethereum virtual machine. To create and view the smart contracts, we will use Remix Web IDE. Actually, for Solidity, there are many IDEs available, but we have chosen to use Remix as it provides not only a compiler, but also a runtime to test a smart contract that you will design. And most of all, it works without any software installation on your computer. Remix supports free runtime testing, and we will be using the JavaScript environment. Before we actually go into the demonstration, there are a few important things to take note of. So first, I would like to briefly introduce what are functions. So function definitions are similar to functions in any other high-level language. They have a function header followed by the code within curly brackets. Function code contains the local data and statements to process the data and return the results of processing. Function header itself can be as simple as an anonymous no-name function to a complex one loaded with a lot of details. The word function is a keyword which is placed at the beginning of all functions, and parameters are any number of pairs of type with its identifier. Return values can be specified as pair type with just the identifier or just the type. When only the type is specified, it has to be explicitly returned using a return statement. If both type and identifier are specified in the return statement, then any state change that happens to the identifier within the function is automatically returned. Unlike common programming languages that allow only one return value, any number of values can be returned from a Solidity function. For example, multiple variables, age and gender, can be assigned return values from a function getAgeGender. We'll also use gas or crypto fuel that is paid for transaction execution and an operation step as set by the Ethereum protocol. And since operations consume gas, as it was discussed by Nisha earlier, choosing appropriate and efficient data structures are important steps in constructing your smart contract. Now, Solidity supports many of the basic types of a high-level language, as it is shown on the slide. The default modifier for functions is private unless you explicitly state the public modifier, if that is what you intend to do. For every data declared with public accessor, getter function is automatically provided. The common statements available in any high-level language are also available in Solidity with very little variation. For example, assignment statement, if else, for, etc. We will develop a basic smart contract and start with the basic design. So first of all, you can take a look at the common and the basic data types on the screen. Now, this is a class diagram for the smart contract we will take a look at. So it will be called bidder. It will have 4 state variables, which are the name of the bidder, the bid amount that the bidder has set, and another thing we will do is verification if the bid is eligible or not. So for that, we have a limit, which is the minimum bid value. And if the bid amount falls less than the minimum bid, then that bidder will be, or that bid amount will be ineligible. And for this purpose, we will have 3 related functions called set name, set bid amount, and determine eligibility. So we will move on to Remix IDE. First, I will just introduce some of the parts of this IDE. The first one that we have is File Explorer. So in this, you can have all your contracts and you can upload them from your computer or your laptop. The next one is the compiler. I want all of you to note that we will be using the 0.4.0 version of the compiler. As you can see, there are many versions, but we will work with this specific version. And the language we are using is Solidity. The next part is the deploying and running part. So you can see we will use the JavaScript virtual machine for deploying and running our transaction. It also provides us with some basic accounts which have 100 Ether in them by default. Okay, so let's look at the smart contract. So I would also like to add on that all the smart contracts you will use right now will be within the scope of your web browser. Remix provides us with a test environment when we use the JavaScript virtual machine, and it stays within your browser and is not published to the blockchain. So first we will look at this bidder data. So the data that we had discussed earlier is included over here. That is, we have the name, the bid amount, the eligibility, and the minimum bid. The first line itself is our specification of the Solidity version we'll be using for the contract. The next line is the name of the contract, and this is the data. So string means that our variable name is going to be of the string type, and public is our modifier, which means access modifier. And public means that it can be accessed from anywhere, even outside the transaction. The next one is bid amount, which has been declared as an integer type. It is also public. That means you can access from anywhere. Then we have eligible, which is a bool value. A Boolean value can be true or false. Then we have the minimum bid amount, which is declared as a constant. That means you cannot change this value. When we declare it as a constant of 1000 as the value, you cannot change it. And we want this minimum bid value to be a constant of integer type. And we will take a look at our smart contract now. So for the purpose of demo, I declare the name as Apple, and you can see we have the three functions defined here. Our function starts with the keyword function. SetName is the name of our function. String nm is the parameter that we will pass to this function, and this function has been declared as public. So the purpose of this function is to set the name variable of a contract to the value that we pass as a parameter. The next is the bid amount. So similarly, we have the set bid amount function, which will take an integer as input and set the amount to be that value. The next function is determine eligibility, which is again public. And over here, we compare the bid amount with the minimum bid. And if the bid amount is greater than or equal to our minimum bid, we set eligible as true. Otherwise, we set it as false. After we have completed the contract, we will compile it. So you can see it says compile bidder.sol. Sol is just the extension for Solidity files. So we compile the contract. You can see we see a green tick. Now we will deploy and run. So you can select any account for deploying the contract. I will use the first one and I will deploy it. As and when these actions are taking place, you can also see the result of the Ethereum virtual machine here as it does every action. And you can see your deployed contracts in this pane. So it says bidder at this. So this value is the address of our contract. And let us look at the entries over here. Bid amount, eligible, and name, these three values are actually your public variables that you had defined. And as I had mentioned earlier, all the public variables automatically get a getter function which can be used to access their value. Now, if I click on name, you will see it gives me a string value of apple. If I check eligible right now, it will say false, which is the default value for a Boolean variable. Bid amount is an integer, which is equal to 0. Again, 0 is the default value for an integer. So let us try and run something. I will set the name as, let's say, workshop. As you can see, my function set name has a parameter. So I set the parameter as workshop and I set the name. You can see the corresponding action being taking place over here. Now, if I again get the name, then we can see that the value has changed to workshop. Now let us set a bid amount. Let's say we set it to 1000, which is our minimum bid value. After setting it, we can determine the eligibility first. And now we can see the bid amount has been set to 1000. And if we click on eligible, we can see that it is eligible. Let us try a value which is less than 1000. I set the bid amount, then I determine the eligibility. You can see that it has been set to false because it is less than the value. And the bid amount has been set to 500. So this is a very basic contract that we saw. Now I will pause the sharing. If you have any questions, then please ask right now. Okay, so someone asked if each action will generate a block in the Ethereum blockchain. Then this is actually not true. Because first of all, as I mentioned, right now we are working only within the limits of our browser. So it is not going to affect the blockchain. And every action is not going to generate a new block in the blockchain. Any other question relating to this contract? Okay, so I will move on to the next one. If you have any questions, then you can always share them. Okay, so before we move on to the next contract, I would like to introduce some more data types. So the first one is address. It can hold a 20-byte Ethereum address, and this address is the address at which our smart contract is referenced to. And this specific data structure also contains the balance of the account in Way, which Misha had told earlier, and 1 Ether is equal to 2 to the power 18 Way. It also supports a function transfer, and to transfer a value, which is used to transfer a value to a specific address. The next one is mapping. It is a versatile data structure that is similar to a key value store. It can also be thought of as a hash table. So the key is typically a secure hash of a simple solidity data type, such as address, and the value in the key value pair can be any arbitrary type. The last one I want to discuss is message. It represents the call that can be used to invoke a function of a smart contract. It supports many attributes, of which are interested in two of them now. First one is message.sender. This holds the address of the sender. And the next is message.value. That has the value in Way sent by the sender. So this is our class design for our next contract. So you have to recall that we always start with the design, say a class diagram, whether we are analyzing a program or coding an application. So in this smart contract, we have two state variables, which is address minter. This will hold the address of the minter. And then we have mapping, which maps the address to an integer. This integer is basically the balance. And we also have four related functions: coin, mint, send, and an event sent. So if you remember, I had said that while discussing the structure of a smart contract, I mentioned that we can have events. So I'll introduce this to you now. Just a second. Okay, so this is our Minter smart contract. Again, we have the Solidity version. We have the name of the contract. And this is our first variable that we had defined in the class diagram, which is address of the minter, and it has been set to public. The next is the mapping, which maps the address to the balance. And now this is the event sent, which takes three parameters. So remember that an event can have a maximum of three parameters: the address from which the amount was sent, the address to which it was sent, and the amount that was sent. So the first function is again public, which is called coin. In this, we assign the minter as the message.sender. So message.sender is the address of the person who created this contract. So only the person who created the contract can mint coins. Then we have the function mint, which has the receiver and the amount. And over here, we are going to check if the message.sender is actually the minter. That means that the person who created the contract is the one which is minting the coins. And if this condition is true, then we return it. That means if the message.sender is not the minter, then we just return, because only the owner of the contract should be allowed to mint. If the owner is the one minting the coins, then we set the receiver, we get the receiver, or we get the balance of the receiver and add the amount that was minted. Then we have another function send. So in this, we have the receiver's address and the amount. So before sending an amount, we need to make sure that sufficient balance is present. So we use this statement to check if the amount is greater than the balance of the sender. If this holds true, then we just return and do not carry out this function. Otherwise, we deduct the amount from the balance of the sender and add the same amount to the receiver's balance. Now over here, we use the event, this send event, and we will see how it plays out when I run the contract. So again, I will save it. Now I will compile the contract and we will deploy it using another account. Okay, so it was deployed and we can see that the contract is over here deployed at, and this is the address of the smart contract. Over here, you can see it says memory. So memory is just like a temporary storage, which is valid only while you are interacting or doing any function in the Remix IDE. So it is very similar to the RAM. So as soon as you shut your computer down, the RAM is wiped. So in the same way, the memory also gets wiped when you shut down Remix IDE. So let's see. So if we click on Minter, as you know that we have defined it as public, so we have a getter function. You can see the address. Now, if you compare this address with the address we used to deploy, it will actually be the same because we are the owner of the contract and we deployed it. So we are going to be the minter. Now, first, let us mint some coins. So for minting, you can see we have to give two parameters, that is the receiver's address and the amount that you want to mint. Now, another thing to remember is that the addresses should always be in double quotes. So I will add a double quote and I will add my address and the amount. Let's say I want to mint 1,000. So I mint. You can see the changes that take place. After minting, I can check my balance. So for checking the balance again, I need to enter the address first. And you can see the balance is 1,000. That is the amount that we minted right now. Let's say I want to send some of this amount to another person. So I will grab another address from here and I will become the owner of the contract first. I will use my address here. I will put the address of my receiver and let's say we want to transfer 400. So I send it. Now, if I come back and check the balance, you can see it has been changed to 400. And if I check my own balance, I will again take the address. It is huge, I know, because it is 256 bits. And check the balance. You can see it has been set to 600. That is because out of the 1,000 I minted, I sent 400 to another address. So through this contract, we could see how message, address, and mapping work. I will switch over to the slides. Does anyone have any question regarding this specific contract? If not, then I will move on. Okay, so now we saw how some simple smart contracts work. So we will look at what are the benefits of smart contracts. So the first one is speed, efficiency, and accuracy. Once a condition is met, the contract is executed immediately. And because smart contracts are digital and automated, there's no paperwork to process and no time spent recording the errors that often result from manually filling in documents. The next one is trust and transparency. Now, because there's no third party involved and because encrypted records of transactions are shared across participants, there's no need to question whether information has been altered for personal benefit. The next one is security. Now, blockchain transaction records are encrypted, which makes them very hard to hack, as it was discussed by Nisha earlier. Moreover, because each record is connected to the previous and subsequent records on a distributed ledger, hackers would have to alter the entire chain just to change a single record. The last one is savings. So smart contracts remove the need for intermediaries to handle the transactions and by extension, their associated time delays and fees. Next, we will look at Ethereum and understand what it exactly is. So Ethereum is an open source blockchain-based platform that creates and shares business, financial services, and entertainment applications. As a blockchain network, Ethereum is a decentralized public ledger for verifying and recording transactions. The network's users can create, publish, monetize, and use applications on the platform and use its Ether cryptocurrency as payment. Ethereum was created to enable developers to build and publish smart contracts and distributed applications that can be used without the risks of downtime, fraud, or interference from a third party. Now the insiders call the decentralized applications on the network as dApps. Ethereum users pay fees to use these dApps. The fees are called gas because they vary depending on the amount of computational power required. Ethereum has its own associated cryptocurrency called Ether or ETH. The Ether cryptocurrency was designed to be used within the Ethereum network. However, like Bitcoin, Ether is now an accepted form of payment by some merchants and service vendors like Overstock, Shopify, and Cheap Air. So these are among the online sites that accept Ether as payment. And I think it is very interesting to note that as a cryptocurrency, Ethereum is second in market value only to Bitcoin as of May 2021. Now, Ethereum claims its platform can be used to codify, decentralize, secure, and trade just about anything. A number of projects are underway to test the concept. So the first one is by Ubisoft. It launched an Ethereum platform blockchain-based collectible game called Rabbids Tokens. Now the Rabbids token game has similarities to the popular CryptoKitties, and CryptoKitties itself was a collectible game which actually created enough network congestion to crash the Ethereum network in 2017. The tokens were part of a game that worked as follows. So you put some money into an Ethereum wallet, use it to buy a rabbit from another user. And upon purchase, that token will start to represent another character from the rabbit's world, with the whole exchange documented in your virtual logbook. Next is JP Morgan Chase. So it built the Quorum blockchain internally using the Ethereum network, and it is being used to run the Interbank Information Network, which is a payments network that involves more than 300 banks. JP Morgan is the largest US bank by assets, and it also said that it would use Quorum to issue a digital currency called the JP Morgan coin that will be designed to make instantaneous payments using blockchain. And this system will be developed with the participation of researchers from Alibaba and Carnegie Mellon University, and will try to overcome a set of unavoidable obstacles to ensure security despite full transparency. The last one is by Microsoft, and it is planning an incentive system to bolster anti-piracy campaigns based on Ethereum called Argus. So it is described as a tool leveraging the blockchain to provide a trustless system that allows piracy reporters to remain anonymous while still operating in a transparent system. And Argus would enable backtracking of pirated content to the source thanks to a corresponding watermark algorithm. Each report filed to Argus would involve an information hiding procedure that allows only the informer to report the same watermarked copy without actually owning it. And the report hopes that with this tool, real-world anti-piracy campaigns will be truly effective by shifting to a fully transparent incentive mechanism. Now we will move on to some hands-on practice. So before that, I would like all of you to open the Remix IDE in case you want to code along. And as I had mentioned earlier, it is very important to first design the contract before you start coding it. So we will be taking a look at the ballot smart contract, and this allows the smart contract creator to be the chairperson who gets a weight of 2 votes for their vote, and all the other voters get a weight of 1 for their vote. Now, each voter will first be registered by the chairperson before they can cast their vote, and they can vote only once. So the class diagram for this is as shown. Now over here, we'll be using another data type, which is called the struct. So struct actually is a composite data type of a group of related data that can be referenced by a single meaningful collective name. So in this case, we have voter and proposal. Now the individual elements of the struct can be accessed using the dot notation. And we will start with the coding. I have to shift to Remix. Okay. So let us create a new contract. I will add a new file, and this file will be called ballot.sol. Okay, so the first statement has to be our Solidity version. So we will say Pragma Solidity, and we will specify the version, which is 0.4.0. And then we will mention the name of the contract, which is ballot. Okay, so first of all, we will have to define all our variables that we will use. First one is going to be struct voter. Now, for this specific structure, there are three important elements that every voter will have. That the first one is the weight, that is the weight of the vote that this voter will cast. The second one is going to be a Boolean value voted, which will be set to true if that voter has already cast their vote, and false if they are yet to cast their vote. So I will define a struct voter, and first will be my integer weight. Second is going to be a bool voted to know if they have voted, if they have cast their vote. And the next one is going to be the vote. So we will store the value for which, the proposal value for which the voter casted their vote. Next, we can define our structure of the proposal itself. Now, I am defining it only as having an integer value, which will have my vote count. That is the number of votes that were cast for this specific proposal. Now, in case there are more details to the proposal, you can add on values to this structure itself. For example, you can mention the name or the name of the person to which this proposal belongs to, and you can add that on your own. The next we are going to have is the address of the chairperson. So chairperson is very important because we know that only the chairperson can register the voters. So we will have the chairperson. And next we need to store the mapping of the voter address with the voter. Because in the voter itself, we have the weight, voted and vote, but we also need to store the address of the voter. So we will create a mapping of address, which will map to our voter structure, voter, and we'll call this as voters. Next, we are going to have, next we are going to have our proposals. Now proposals is going to be an array of the structure proposal. And we will define our proposals like that. Okay, so now we have our proposals as well. Let's go back to our data. Our class design. You can see we have defined all our variables, and now we will define our functions. So we have ballot, register, vote, and winning proposal. So the first one is our function ballot. This function is going to be our constructor. And as I had mentioned earlier, we can have only one type of constructor, which is either default or user defined. In this case, we are defining it on our own because we need to set the value for proposals before we can start with the voting itself. So it will take a value of integer, which is going to be our number of proposals. And we will define it as public because we need to be able to access it. Okay, so in this, we'll do all our assignments. So first we will assign the value of chairperson, who is going to be message.sender. As you can recall from the previous contract, the message.sender is the owner of the contract. And in this case, our owner is going to be our chairperson. So we have this. Next, we have the voters. So our very first voter is going to be our chairperson. And for the chairperson, we have the weight as set as 2, to be set as 2. Okay, so how do we access the individual elements of the struct? We use this dot notification. So our voters is a mapping from address to voter. So first we do voters chairperson. This is how we access the voter value for our chairperson, and we set its weight as 2. Next, we are going to initialize our proposals. So proposals dot length is going to be our number of proposals. This. Now we are done with our constructor. Let's move on to the next function, which is register. So we have function register. For registering, we need the address of the voter. So address to voter is going to be our parameter. And with this parameter, we will register our voter. This is going to be public, as we need to be able to register voters. And first, we need to check if the person registering the voter is the chairperson themselves. So for that, we will check message.sender. Now, if message.sender is not equal to the chairperson, then they should not be registered. But another thing to consider is if the vote has already been casted by that voter, or that voter already exists. So we will do another checking with our OR function. So first we'll check if the owner of the contract is not the one registering, or if the voters already has the one we are trying to register. So in this case, we will just return and not continue with the function. And if this actually returns to false, then we should be able to register the voters. So for that, we are going to do voters, and we will add the address. We will define the weight as 1 because everyone except the chairperson has a weight of 1. And we will also set the value of voted as false. Okay, so now we are done with this function as well. We will move on to our voting function. So function vote. Now, when we are voting, we just need to know the proposal for which the user is voting. So we will do function vote, uint, and we have the 2 proposal functions. So we know for which proposal we are voting. Then we are going to define it as public. Now we'll have a voter. Okay, so I'm going to be using another keyword here, which is storage. So what storage does is, as I had mentioned earlier, memory can be wiped and it is temporary, but storage is persistent. So anything that you define as storage and add it with the storage keyword will remain persistent in the blockchain and it won't be changed. So we need this function for our voting so that if any person has already cast their vote, they are not able to change it. So sender as voters message.sender. And Then we will see if the sender has voted or not. If the person has voted, or we also need to check if the proposal they are voting for actually exists. So we will see if the proposal exists by a simple length check. So over here, since for the proposal itself, we are going to be using just integer values to define the name of the proposal, we can just check if the proposal the user is voting for is greater than the length. Because if I define a number of proposals as 5, then I'm going to have 5 proposals, which will be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we can do a simple check. And if this condition is true, then we should just return from the function. However, if this is not true, then we will send sender.voted should be set as true. And we will increase the number of votes a specific proposal got. Sorry, okay, yes. The proposal. And we will set the vote count of this. Equal to 1. Okay, sender.wait, because if our chairperson is voting, then it should be, then 2 should be added. And if another normal voter is voting, then 1 should be added. Now we'll have another function, the last function that we had defined, which is the winning proposal. So we will define function winning proposal. It won't take any input, and it's going to be a public function because everyone should be able to access this. Okay, so we are going to define it as a constant because whatever functions that we define as constant are included to enable the client applications to call to obtain the result, and the constant modifier prevents it from changing the state of the smart contract. And more importantly, this call comes directly to the smart contract and not via a transaction. And since it is not going to change the state of our contract, it won't actually be stored on the blockchain, which is okay because it is not making any change to the state. And over here, we will return which proposal is the winning one. And I will return the value of uint 8, which will be my winning proposal. So for computing the winning proposal, first I need to have the voting count. I will define my winning vote count. Initialize it to 0. And then we'll run a loop through all the proposals and check which one has the maximum number of votes. So I will define a loop variable called, let's say, p, which is going to be from 0 till the value is less than the length of the proposals. Dot length. And we'll increment it by 1 every time. So I'll just do p++. Now, within this for loop, I will check if my proposals, okay, so if my p proposal has a vote count which is greater than my winning vote count. So if it is greater than the winning vote count, then I will change the value of the winning vote count to be the vote count of my current proposal. I'll just copy this from here. And I will also set the value of the winning proposal. The winning proposal is going to be my. So this completes our contract. Does anyone have any doubts till now regarding how it was designed or the various functions? Okay, so I think I'll just move on. First, I'll save it and I'll go to my compiler and compile it. Okay, so it's compiled. Now we will deploy our contract. I'm going to use this account for deploying because it has not been used right now. Okay, so before deploying, if you remember, we made a custom constructor which takes in the value of the number of proposals. So let's say I want to have 3 proposals. And I also want you all to remember that the account that we are using to deploy this contract will be the account of the chairperson. So I'll keep it as CA. I deploy the contract. You can see it specifies here. So actually there is an error in the class design over here. For example, if I click on winning proposal, it will show me as 0. This is because this is the default value. And I wanted to highlight this especially because if in such a simple contract, we can have this fault, then it can have major effects in case we deploy it on the blockchain. So that is why I had mentioned earlier that it is very important to decide all the if-then statements and also have a proper design of the contract before you actually code it. I will also discuss some ways in which you can use to prevent this error from happening. So first, we need to register our voters. For registering, I will, let's say, take this account, copy its address, switch back to the chairperson's account because only the chairperson can deploy the can register a voter. Now for registering, I need to give the address, which has to be in double quotes. Now this is my address and I'll register the voter. Okay, so now my voter has been registered. You can see we do not have a function here to get the value of the voters. This is so because we did not define it as public over here. And by default, if we do not specify a access specifier, it is private. So it can only be accessed from within the contract. Okay, so I have registered this voter. Now let's register another voter. I registered 4B, let's do 787. I will change to the chairperson's account, paste the address here and register. Okay, so now we have 2 extra voters which are registered. Now we will first cast the vote as a chairperson. Let's say we want to vote for the first proposal. So our first proposal is actually proposal 0. So we define the length of the proposals as 3. So our proposals are going to be 0, 1, and 2. Let's vote for the 0. Vote. Okay, so now the chairperson has casted their vote. We will go to another account that was registered and cast our vote. So let's say we want to cast the vote to the last proposal, which is going to be our second number 2 proposal, and we'll vote. We'll again switch our account to the third person, this person, and we are going to cast our vote for the second proposal, which is 1, and we'll vote. Now, if we see the winning proposal, you can see it says 0. This is so because our chairperson had casted vote for this proposal and the weightage of the chairperson's vote is 2. So this is how we can use this, and I will address how we can change that error that was coming. That is when there are no votes that were cast and still we could see that the winning proposal was 0. So you can actually correct this by maybe adding time elements. So what time elements do is you can define your states in which the contract can be, for example, in the registering state, in the voting state, and the end of voting state. So if your contract is in the registering state, then you can only allow voters to be registered. And if your contract is in the voting state, then only voting should happen. So you can use time elements and make changes to the current contract to actually improve the design of the contract. I will go back to my slides. Okay, now we will discuss some criticisms of Ethereum. So Ethereum faces the same criticisms that all cryptocurrency platforms face. So prices of all cryptocurrencies, including Ether, tend to mirror Bitcoin price action. This has been evident for years and is front and center at present. For example, in 2017, Bitcoin's value seesawed between about $900 to $20,000. And in April 2021, Bitcoin hit a high of around 63K and hovered around 30K. So as such, cryptocurrencies remain highly speculative and subject to both bullish and bearish periods. Each of these networks is eating up a vast amount of energy. Cryptocurrency miners in particular are devoting a huge amount of computing power to the process of validating transactions. One of China's reasons for cracking down on cryptocurrency was there is the fossil fuel energy drain caused by large-scale crypto coin mining operations. As it was discussed by Nisha earlier, a blockchain may be invulnerable to hacker attacks, but it's not for the lack of trying. Ethereum's biggest moment came in April 2016 with a radical experiment called the Distributed Autonomous Organization, or the DAO. It was created by German blockchain startup Slog.it. The DAO had an ambitious goal: to build a humanless venture capital firm that would allow the investors to make all the decisions through smart contracts. There would be no leaders, no authorities, only rules coded by humans and executed by computer protocols. For Ethereum, the backbone of the project, it was a major vote of confidence in its nascent technology. Then it got hacked. That's right, the Ethereum got hacked. So on June 17th, someone started siphoning money out of the DAO, and people were watching it in real time as the money was stolen, like a live video feed of a bank robbery. By the end, the hacker, who has said that he was simply taking advantage of a technical loophole in the DAO, had amassed around $50 million in Ether, based on the exchange rates at that time. While the core developers who designed and ran Ethereum didn't really have anything to do with the DAO, they were left to deal with the mess. The Ethereum community opted to reverse the theft by creating a hard fork, which was discussed by Nisha earlier. So what it led to was that it invalidated the existing blockchain and created a second Ethereum blockchain. So the one that we were using was the Ethereum blockchain, and the original one was actually called the Ethereum Classic. Another such hard fork took place very recently in August, and it was called the London hard fork. It had 5 improvement proposals, as you can see on the screen. So the biggest benefit of the new update is that it should enable the network to handle many more transactions per second. There are also hopes that this added scalability will tackle high gas fees. It also aims to change the speed and incentivization of Ethereum mining. There is no limit on Ethereum count, as it is an inflationary cryptocurrency. Miners are rewarded with brand new coins every time they validate a block. They are compensated with the transaction fees that are paid by users. Once the update is rolled out, miners will no longer receive income from transaction fees. This will reduce the supply and give Ethereum a much needed boost. It would also make transaction fees more predictable for those who use this blockchain. The upgrade will ensure that no amount of network congestion results in shooting up Ethereum gas price. This step of price transparency will single-handedly help increase the adoption of decentralized applications. So with that, we come to the end of our workshop. Thank you so much for joining. I will stop sharing first. And before actually taking any more questions, I would also like to share with you that next week we have a very exciting workshop, which will be Introduction to Malware Analysis. So please be sure to sign up when the links are shared. And now you can ask us any questions that you might have regarding the contracts or the blockchain.
Okay, so I guess I'll take this one. Yeah, so when you say immutability, or rather when anyone says immutability, it doesn't mean that the data stored in the blockchain can't be changed. It's more like if they change or if they tamper with the blocks, it will easily be picked up by everyone. So if you remember, I mentioned the hash, which is derived from the block's content. So if the block's content gets changed, then the hash also would technically change. So while cross-verifying, like the whole point of mining is to verify the transactions and validate that they're legitimate, that they haven't been tampered with. So if you tamper with a particular block and then try to hash it, the hash is not going to match the hash that's already there in the block, and that's how you can easily pick up if blocks have been tampered with. So that's why it's pretty hard to tamper with the blocks, and thus you say it's immutable, because you know for a fact that it hasn't been changed, because even if it does, you can easily pick it up. Like, it's very transparent. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Let me know if you have any other questions. Yeah, it does. Especially it depends on the consensus protocol that you use. So if you're using the proof of work protocol, then theoretically, yes, it takes up a lot of power, because the hashing method to like beat the difficulty level is basically brute force. So you'll just have to keep doing trial and error over and over, and it takes up a lot of computational resources. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Let me know if you have anything else.
With the New London Fork, actually, they are planning on doing that. So they have divided the fees into two parts. The first one is going to be like a base one, and the second one is going to be the burned fees. I'm not sure how it is being done right now because the fork was done very recently, but we will see the change in like some duration of time, because firstly, they are saying that the Ethereum prices will also be stabilized, but that change will also take some time to actually reflect. So I think we'll have to wait for a little while before we can see that change being reflected. If anyone has questions, okay, sorry. Nisha, you want to take the question?
I wouldn't say it's not feasible, because at the end of the day, you still have a lot of advantages of blockchain. Like, the primary advantage of blockchain is the decentralization part of it and the fact that it's transparent. And the value of the cryptocurrency can be a lot. It's just, and honestly, it's the miners who have to invest in a lot of cost, but at the end of the day, they earn it back through rewards. So I wouldn't say it's infeasible. because a lot of companies also use blockchain. Like Linux is the one that created Hyperledger, which is a private blockchain. Yeah, hope that answers your question.
So this is actually true that with Ethereum 2.0, since it was a hard fork, the Ethereum blockchain will be invalidated. And as a result, there was actually a lot of pushback as well regarding this whole hard fork. It was actually, I think, planned for earlier and it got postponed. But the benefits that arise from this will be greater, and that is why they decided to proceed with this, because of the whole gas, like the main aim was to control the gas prices, and they could see in the long run that this will prove to be more beneficial, and that is why they decided to roll this update. If anyone has any questions regarding the contracts or the coding part as well, you can ask. I will also like to add on, the London hard fork doesn't mean it took place in London. The London word is actually for their, I think, some event or conference that takes place. So this year it was conducted in London, and so they called the hard fork as London hard fork. Thank you so much for joining.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I wouldn't say we can't really say the best one. It's just that we make sure that the data in the block is valid, that the transactions are valid. I would just say that the pros and cons of both are there are pros and cons for each of the consensus protocols. So yes, right now Ethereum is using proof of work, and like I previously mentioned, it takes up a lot of energy and it takes up a lot of time. So that's why you have proof of stake, where it is more energy efficient, but at the same time the validators coins are at stake there. So instead of losing power, you're actually losing your own money. So I guess which one is the best is honestly up for debate. It's just that each has its own pros and cons.
Since we do not have any more questions, we will be ending the workshop soon. So if you have any more questions, you can address them right now. I think we can share the slides. The Ethereum smart contracts are not exactly vulnerable to hacks, but it is more like finding loopholes, because as I mentioned, you are defining conditions and policies into code. So what can happen is there might be some edge cases that you do not consider, or for example, what happened with our winning proposal, that we did not we did not cast any vote, and still the winning proposal was defined as the first proposal. So these things can happen, and if it can happen in such a simple contract, then when we are having more complex contracts, it can happen like more more commonly it can happen. That is why you need to design your contract very well, and you also need to explore all the edge cases and all the, let's say, like abnormalities that can occur. So it's not exactly vulnerable to hacks, but rather people taking advantage of technical loopholes. Does that answer your question? Oh, yes. You can take a look at the Solidity documentation itself, or even the Remix website, I think. Or I'll just open the link and share the link. I can check the link once. Just a second. Okay, so this is the link for Ethereum, basically, like the documentation. So you can check this out. It introduces a lot more things, because what I covered was very, very little part of the whole thing. So you can take a look at the documentation. And I think I had I have to find the link for the design practices. I'll just check once.